Every single day, I watched her wrap up my half-eaten steak and slip it into her bag when she thought no one was looking. I never stopped her. I never said a word. Because I had a secret too, and mine was about to change both of our lives forever. If you've ever judged someone before knowing their full story, this one is going to hit you hard. Stay until the end, because the twist will leave you speechless. Hit that like button now, subscribe if you're new, and let's get into it. Every single day, I watched her wrap up my half-eaten steak and slip it into her bag when she thought no one was looking. I never stopped her. I never said a word. I never cleared my throat or made her feel small. I just watched. From the corner of my eye, behind my glass of sparkling water, behind the Wall Street Journal, I wasn't really reading anymore. And every single time, she was so careful about it, so quiet. Like she had practiced the motion 100 times. Fold the napkin, tuck the container, zip the bag, straighten up, smile at the next table like nothing happened, like she wasn't carrying something home that I had left behind without a second thought. I told myself I didn't care. I told myself it wasn't my business. I am a man who owns $400 million worth of commercial real estate across 7 states. A half-eaten plate of prime rib is not something I lose sleep over. But here's the thing about silence. When you keep it long enough, it starts asking you questions you are not ready to answer. And the question that kept coming back to me, the one I couldn't shake no matter how many board meetings I sat through or how many contracts crossed my desk, was this: who is she feeding? I didn't know it then. I couldn't have known it then. But the answer to that one quiet question was going to reach into my chest, find something I thought was buried forever, and pull it straight back into the light. Now, before I go any further, if you have ever looked at someone and made up your mind about them in 30 seconds, if you have ever assumed you knew someone's story just from the surface of it, just from the shoes they were wearing, or the job they were doing, or the way they moved through a room trying not to be noticed, this one is going to hit you hard. Stay with me until the very end, because I promise you, the twist in this story is not something you will see coming. Not even close. I didn't see it coming, and I am the one it happened to. If this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button right now, because we tell stories on this channel that you will not find anywhere else. Real, human, gut-punch stories about the moments that change everything. Hit the like button too, because it helps more people find stories like this one, and honestly, Nora's story deserves to be heard by every single person who will listen. All right, let's go back to the beginning. My name is Clifford Hale, and for the last 6 years, I have been a man who eats alone. That is not a complaint. I want to be clear about that. It is simply a fact. The way Tuesday follows Monday, the way winter follows fall. Some things in life stop being painful after long enough. They just become the shape of your days. Eating alone is the shape of mine. I wake up at 5:15 every morning in a house that has 11 rooms and no noise. I make 1 cup of coffee, black, no sugar, and I sit at a kitchen table that seats 8. I read contracts, I answer emails, I move numbers from one column to another, and somewhere around 6 years ago, I stopped noticing how quiet it was. Or maybe I just stopped admitting that I noticed. My wife Caroline died on a Wednesday in November, pancreatic cancer, 14 months from diagnosis to the last breath. We had 22 years together before that, and I would give back every dollar I have ever made to get back one Tuesday morning with her, just one, sitting across from me at that ridiculous 8-person table she insisted on buying because she always believed our house would fill up with people someday. It never did, and then she was gone. And the table just stayed there, big and empty and so painfully full of everything we never got to have. After Caroline, I became a very efficient man. Efficient is the kindest word for it. My assistant Gerald would probably use the word difficult. My board would probably use the word impossible. But I kept the business running. I kept moving. Because moving was the only thing that kept me from sitting still long enough to feel the full weight of what I had lost. The one indulgence I allowed myself, the one small, quiet ritual I held on to, was lunch. Every Tuesday and Thursday, I went to the ivory table. A small, upscale restaurant downtown. Dark wood paneling, white tablecloths, soft lighting even at noon. The kind of place where the staff learns your name after the second visit and your order after the third. I always sat at the same corner table. I always ordered the same thing: prime rib, garlic mashed potatoes, sparkling water with lemon. And I always ate alone, with the journal open in front of me, and the rest of the world held at a very comfortable distance. I never finished the plate. I never took anything home. What would be the point? There was no one waiting. There was no second person to say, "Here, try this. It's better than it looks." So I left what I left, folded my napkin, put on my coat, and walked back out into a city that had no idea and no interest in what I carried. That was my life. Neat, controlled, sealed shut. And then one Thursday afternoon, I forgot my watch at the table. Just a watch. A simple thing. I turned back to get it, and I stopped in the doorway. And I saw her, a woman in a white uniform shirt, moving quickly but carefully, folding the white paper around the edges of my plate with both hands, like she was wrapping something precious. Like what I had left behind without a thought meant something to someone I had never once looked at. I stood there for a long moment. Then I turned around, left without the watch, and I thought about her the entire drive home. I told myself it was nothing, just a coincidence, a moment, the kind of thing you see and forget by the time you reach your car. I told myself that on the drive home, and again at dinner that night, alone, at that big empty table, and again the next morning over my black coffee and my contracts. Night, alone, at that big empty table, and again the next morning over my black coffee and my contracts. But Tuesday came, and I went back, and she did it again. This time I didn't forget anything. I had no reason to linger, but I slowed down as I reached the door, and I glanced back over my shoulder, and there she was. Same careful hands, same quiet efficiency, same small zip of the bag beneath the counter. And something about the deliberateness of it, the tenderness of it, stopped me cold all over again. Her name tag said Nora. I started paying attention in a way I hadn't paid attention to anything in years. Not to contracts, not to numbers. To her. Not in a strange way. Please understand that. But in the way you pay attention when something refuses to leave the back of your mind, no matter how many times you push it away. I noticed that she wore the same two outfits on rotation. A white shirt with a small fraying collar on Tuesdays and a slightly newer one on Thursdays. I noticed her shoes. Black, flat, scuffed at the toes in the particular way that happens when you are on your feet for 8, 9, 10 hours at a stretch. I noticed that during her break, while the other staff sat together near the back eating whatever the kitchen prepared, Nora sat alone by the service window with a glass of water. Just water. Every single time. She wasn't eating. She was saving. I understood that without anyone telling me. And something about understanding it, really understanding what that meant, what kind of quiet daily sacrifice that was, did something to me that I was not prepared for. It cracked something open that I had spent 6 years cementing shut, so I did what I always do when something unsettles me. I gathered information. I called my assistant Gerald, a loyal, discreet man who has worked with me for 19 years and who has learned never to ask why, only what. And I asked him to find out what he could about a waitress named Nora Wells at the ivory table downtown. Not to cause trouble, not to expose anything. I just needed to understand. What Gerald found was almost ordinary. She was 39 years old, had worked at the restaurant for 4 years, paid rent on a small one-bedroom apartment on the east side of the city, the part of the city where the streets are a little narrower and the buildings a little older and the people a little more tired. Clean record, no debt in collections, no drama, just a woman showing up and doing the work and going home. But then Gerald mentioned one small detail almost as an afterthought. He said, "She makes several stops a week at a grocery store 3 blocks from her apartment. Always the same items: baby formula, children's paracetamol, soft bread, bananas." I set the phone down. She had no children. Gerald had confirmed that. She was buying food and medicine for someone else's babies. and she was doing it on a waitress salary that barely covered her own rent, and she was taking my leftovers not out of hunger, not for herself, but because there were small children somewhere in a cold apartment who needed to eat tonight. I sat in my 11-room house in complete silence, and for the first time in 6 years, I felt genuinely, deeply ashamed of how little I had noticed about the world just outside my corner table. I want to tell you about the moment your entire understanding of something changes. Not slowly, not gradually, but all at once, like a wall you have been leaning against your whole life, suddenly isn't there anymore, and you are stumbling forward into open air, grabbing at nothing. That is what Tuesday felt like. Gerald called me at 7 in the morning. I remember exactly where I was standing, by the kitchen window, coffee in hand, watching the neighbor's oak tree losing its last few leaves in the November wind. He said he had kept looking into Nora's background like I asked. He said he had found something and that he didn't quite know how to say it. Gerald has worked with me for 19 years. He has delivered bad news about collapsing deals, failed inspections, broken partnerships. He has never once struggled to find the words. He struggled that morning. He told me that Nora's full legal name, the name on her original birth record before her adoption, was Nora Elaine Wells Hale. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just stood there with the coffee going cold in my hand and the oak tree losing its leaves outside and the name echoing in a place inside my chest that I thought had gone completely silent. Hale. Gerald kept talking. He told me that Nora had been born to a 19-year-old woman in a small hospital in a small town about 200 miles from where I was standing, that the mother had signed the adoption papers 3 days after the birth, that the mother's name on the original record was Caroline Elaine Whitmore, Caroline, my Caroline. Before she was Caroline Hale, before she was mine, she had a daughter. She carried that secret across 22 years of marriage, across every quiet morning and every shared dinner and every late night when I thought I knew every corner of her. She carried it alone, and she never told me. Not once. Not even at the end, when there was nothing left to protect and nothing left to lose. I sat down on the kitchen floor. I don't know why the floor. I just couldn't make it to a chair. Gerald told me one more thing. He said there was a letter, a sealed envelope that had been sitting with Caroline's attorney for 6 years, with instructions that it be forwarded to me only if, and he read the exact words carefully, Nora ever finds her way to him. The attorney had been waiting. For 6 years that letter had been sitting in a drawer, waiting for a sign that the distance between Nora and me had closed enough to matter. A half-eaten plate of prime rib. That was the sign. That was how she found her way to me. The letter arrived by courier that same afternoon. I held it for a long time before I opened it. It was in Caroline's handwriting, that careful, slightly slanted script I would know anywhere, the one she used for birthday cards and grocery lists, and the note she left on my pillow the morning she went in for her first round of treatment that said, "Don't you dare fall apart on me, Clifford Hale." She wrote that she had searched for Nora for years after she was old enough to look, that she had found her, that she had stood outside Nora's building more than once, leaving flowers by the door and never knocking because she was afraid of rejection, afraid of reopening a wound she had spent a lifetime quietly bleeding from alone. She wrote, "I watched her, Clifford. She is so good. She is so quietly, stubbornly good in a world that has not been kind to her. And I was too afraid and too ashamed and too late. Please do what I couldn't. Please just see her. That's all she has ever needed. Someone to finally, truly see her." I folded the letter. I pressed it against my chest. And I wept in a way I had not wept since the day I stood at a graveside in November and watched them lower the only person who ever made that enormous empty table feel small enough. The woman I had watched quietly wrapping leftovers for weeks, the woman feeding other people's children on a salary that left nothing for herself, was the daughter my wife had spent a lifetime loving from a distance too frightened to cross. And my company had turned her away without a second glance 2 years ago. She had been right there, and none of us had seen her. I did not sleep that night. I lay in the dark in that big, quiet house, and I stared at the ceiling, and I let every single thing I had been carrying settle onto my chest at once. The grief I had packed away neatly for 6 years. The guilt of a man who thought efficiency was the same thing as strength. The image of Caroline standing outside a building she never had the courage to walk into, leaving flowers by a door that never opened for her. And somewhere across this city, Nora Wells was asleep in a small apartment, completely unaware that the woman who had left those flowers was her mother. Completely unaware that the quiet, cold man at the corner table had been carrying half of her story without knowing it. I thought about who Nora was, not what Gerald's report said, not the facts and the figures, who she actually was. A woman who had been handed a difficult life from the very beginning, given away at 3 days old, raised by people who were kind but couldn't give her much, who studied hard and ran out of money, and never complained loudly enough for anyone to hear. A woman who, on a salary that barely kept her own lights on, was quietly making sure children in her building didn't go to bed hungry. She wasn't doing it for recognition. She wasn't doing it because someone was watching. She was doing it because it was simply, quietly, the right thing to do. And I thought about myself. A man with $400 million who left food on a plate twice a week without a second thought. A man who had walked past suffering for years because suffering existed outside the radius of his corner table and his Wall Street Journal, and his very carefully maintained distance from everything that might make him feel something. The reckoning was not loud. It did not arrive with thunder. It arrived the way the most important truths always do. Quietly, in the dark, when there is no distraction left and nowhere left to look except directly at yourself. I thought about the job application. That one gutted me more than almost anything else. 2 years ago, Nora had sat somewhere, maybe at that small apartment table, maybe at a library computer, and she had carefully typed up her experience and her skills and the 2 years of accounting she had completed before the money ran out. She had applied to my firm. She had tried, in her own quiet way, to build something better, and someone in my HR department had looked at the incomplete degree and moved her application to the rejection pile without a second thought, without ever once sending it upstairs, without ever once letting it reach my desk. She had tried to find her way to a better life, and the door that could have opened for her had my name on it, and it stayed shut. I am not telling you this so you will feel sorry for me. I am telling you this because I need you to understand what karma actually looks like up close. It does not always arrive as punishment. Sometimes it arrives as a mirror. Sometimes the universe does not strike you down. It simply waits until you are still enough and quiet enough and broken open enough to finally see the full picture of what you missed. And what I had missed was a woman who deserved to be seen a long, long time ago. I got up before dawn, I made my coffee, I sat at that enormous empty table, and I made a decision, not out of guilt, not out of grief, not out of some desperate need to rewrite what Caroline never got to finish. I made it because it was simply, quietly, the right thing to do. Nora had been teaching me that without ever saying a word. I went back on a Thursday, not because it was my usual day, not out of habit or routine or the mechanical comfort of repetition that had carried me through 6 hollow years. I went back because for the first time in longer than I could remember, I actually wanted to be somewhere. I wanted to walk through that door and sit down and be present in a way I had been failing at. For most of my adult life, I did not sit at my corner table. I sat at the counter instead, right where she worked, right where she could see me and I could see her. No journal, no distance, no carefully maintained wall between me and the rest of the human race. Nora noticed immediately. I watched something flicker across her face, a small confusion, a quiet alertness, but she composed herself in half a second the way people do when they have spent years managing their reactions in front of others. She brought my water without being asked, sparkling with lemon. She remembered. I asked her if she would sit with me for 5 minutes during her break, She looked at me for a moment, measuring, cautious, and then she nodded. She sat down across from me with her hands folded on the counter and her back very straight, and I understood in that moment that this was a woman who had been in uncomfortable situations before and had learned to meet them with dignity rather than retreat. She was not nervous, she was simply careful, and I respected that more than I could say. I asked her about her life, not the report, not the facts Gerald had gathered. I asked her, in her own words, in her own voice, who she was and where she came from and what she had wanted for herself when she was young enough to want things without apology. She told me quietly and without self-pity. The adoption, the kind but struggling family, the 2 years of accounting classes she had loved genuinely and completely before the money made the decision for her. The 7 years of waitressing that were never supposed to be permanent but had somehow become the whole of it. She spoke about her neighbor, a young mother named Ruth who worked night shifts at a laundry facility and came home at 4 in the morning with barely enough left in her to stand. She spoke about Ruth's 2 small children, a boy of 3 and a girl not yet 2, and the way they looked at Nora when she knocked on the door with something warm wrapped in a napkin, like she was the most reliable thing in their small, uncertain world. She was not telling me this for sympathy. She was just answering the question, honestly, plainly, without decoration. And I sat there and I listened to every single word. Really listened. The way I should have been listening to the world around me for years. When she finished, I reached into my jacket and I slid a plain white envelope across the counter. She looked at it and then looked at me, and I said, "Just open it." Inside was a photograph of Caroline, young, 19 years old, smiling at the camera with that particular brightness she carried her whole life, that warmth that filled whatever room she walked into. And beneath the photograph, a single handwritten note in my own hand that said, "She loved you before she ever had the words for it. She never stopped, and she sent me to tell you." The change that moved across Nora's face in that moment is something I will carry with me for the rest of my life. It was not dramatic, it was not loud. It was the expression of someone who had spent their entire existence quietly wondering if they had ever truly mattered to anyone, and suddenly, in the space of one breath, receiving the answer. Her eyes filled. She pressed her hand over her mouth, and in barely a whisper she said, "There was a woman outside my building years ago. She left wildflowers by the door and was always gone before I could open it. I used to think she had the wrong address. She never had the wrong address. She was exactly where she meant to be, just too afraid to knock." We sat in silence for a long time after that. The restaurant moved around us, plates clinking, the low murmur of other conversations, the ordinary beautiful noise of people living their lives, and neither of us tried to fill the quiet with words it didn't need. What happened after that, I will tell you plainly and without fanfare, because Nora would not have wanted fanfare. I contacted the director of my firm's existing scholarship program, a fund we had established years ago for working adults returning to complete their education. Nora's application went through the proper process, reviewed on merit alone. She qualified. She enrolled in the spring semester to complete her accounting degree. She did that herself. I simply made sure the door was unlocked. I arranged through an anonymous community fund for 3 months of Ruth's rent to be covered. Ruth never knew where it came from. That was the point. And Dale, the manager who had stood in the back hallway and threatened to strip away the one small dignity Nora had quietly claimed, it emerged through an internal audit, triggered by a formal complaint filed not by me, but by Nora herself, that he had been systematically skimming from the staff tip pool for almost 2 years. He was dismissed within the week. Every penny was recovered and returned to the employees he had stolen from. Nora was offered his position. She thanked them graciously and declined. She had somewhere to be. She had a degree to finish and a future that was finally pointing in the right direction. On her last shift, I came in one final time. I ordered the prime rib, the garlic mash, the sparkling water with lemon. And for the first time, I finished every single bite. I left a tip, a folded note beside the empty plate that said, "You fed strangers when you had nothing left. You were never waiting to be rescued. You were just waiting for someone to finally, truly see you. Caroline saw you first. I was just slow to catch up. I walked out into the cold afternoon, and I stood on the pavement for a moment, and I looked up at the sky the way you do when you are trying to hold yourself together in public, and I thought about Caroline, about the letter, about wildflowers left outside a door that never opened in time. I thought, she found her way to me, Caroline, just like you hoped. And for the first time in 6 years, the grief in my chest felt less like an ending and more like a bridge, something that had connected two people across time and silence and loss, and delivered them, imperfectly, belatedly, but truly, to each other. The table at home still seats 8. For the first time since Caroline left, I found myself thinking, maybe someday it won't feel so empty. Nora never asked for a single thing, not once. She just kept showing up, kept giving what little she had, kept being good in the quiet, unglamorous way that the world rarely stops to notice. And that goodness, that stubborn, selfless, bone-deep goodness, found its way back to her. Not because life is always fair, but because some things, somehow, have a way of circling back. If this story moved you the way it moved me, share it. Put it in front of someone who needs to hear it today, someone who is tired, someone who feels invisible, someone who has been quietly doing the right thing for a long time without anyone noticing. Let them know the world sees more than they think. Hit the like button. Subscribe if you are new here, and come back, because there are more stories like this one waiting to be told. Stories about ordinary people carrying extraordinary things. Stories that remind us that the most important moments in life rarely announce themselves. Sometimes they arrive quietly, in a small restaurant, at a corner table, with a half-eaten plate of prime rib, and they change everything.